Hi everybody and welcome to our Facebook Live question and answer session today. I'm Renza Shibilia. I work at Diabetes Australia and we're so lucky today to be joined again by Professor Jane Spate, who is the Foundation Director at the Australian Centre for Behavioural Research in Diabetes, furthermore today to be referred to as the ACBRG. Jane, hello and welcome.
Hi Renza, hi everyone, good to see you again.
How are you going today?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well. Today we're talking all about hypos. Diabetes Australia this week has launched our campaign, The Lowdown. We have a hashtag Hypos Happen. This is the second year that we have run this campaign. We ran it last year and it's a really terrific opportunity for people with diabetes to share their stories about living with hypoglycemia, which is a reality for people with type 1 and people with type 2 diabetes taking insulin or other glucose lowering medication. So before we start, Jane, because we've got so much to talk about, I will say that everybody gets a chance to be a part of this campaign. You can join the conversation and share how hypos impact on your mental health. Do you have a story about having a hypo in public that you'd like to share, or any other story that you'd like to share with us? You can share a video, you can share a photo, and give us the lowdown on your hypos. Emily is going to share details of how you can participate in the comments of our Facebook page that we're using right now. And if you enter, you can actually, if you participate, you'll go into the draw to win a $250 Visa debit voucher, which will be coming very, very handy at this time of year. Just make sure that you use the hashtag Hypos Happen so that we can keep an eye on your post. But Jane, let's talk about hypos. Why, I guess what I really want to focus on today is we're not going to be talking about the nitty gritty of what a hypo is and what it means to be hypo and how to treat hypos. We've got lots of information about that on our website. Today, we're actually going to be talking about how hypos affect people with diabetes in our day-to-day lives when we have hypos, because that can be really quite significant for people, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as well, like you said, we're not going to go into the nitty gritty of hypos, but there's so many different types of hypos. There's self-treated hypos, there's severe hypos, there's hypos while you're asleep, there's the hypos that happen when you're out and about and, you know, you're trying to get on with other things and you may not even notice that you're having it until it's a bit too late. And so there's so many ways, of course, then, in which all of that can impact on how you're living your life and how you feel about having hypos and how you feel about your diabetes. So it's, yeah, there's a huge range of impact that it can have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that I've really noticed, I've been living with diabetes now for 22 years, very close to 22 years. And I remember hypos were presented to me in a very, in a way that was, you know, really very textbook. You know, this is what it is, this is what happens, this is how you'll feel, and this is how you treat it, and then it's all done and that's it. But the reality that I discovered was that not only are there so many different hypos, but it's a lot more than just making sure that I have some fast-acting glucose and then get on with my life. It actually really started to impact how I was feeling about diabetes. Why is that something that happens? Why do people start to feel, I guess, so concerned or scared or anxious or just annoyed and frustrated about hypoglycemia?
Yeah, there's lots of different reasons why people feel that way, and none of them are particularly surprising. So if you sort of break it down into three main categories of the impacts of hypoglycemia, you've got the physical consequences, the psychological consequences, or the emotional consequences, if you like, and also the social consequences. So if we think about, you know, hypoglycemia and its symptoms, you know, many of the symptoms are quite unpleasant. So sometimes they're not that bad and people can get on with it and so on, but other times the symptoms are pretty, you know, horrible to be living with. Loss of consciousness would be, you know, terrible for people. So there's also risk of injury, you know, to yourself or to others, particularly if you're driving or, you know, operating machinery, that kind of thing. And then, of course, we, you know a bit more these days, and I won't go into that today, but, you know, the sort of the more medical side of things, like the risk of cardiac issues and other sort of more serious medical consequences. So all of those physical consequences are a reason why people wouldn't like having hypoglycemia. Then you add on to that how it makes you feel. So the low glucose levels can affect your mood. They can, you know, lead you to feeling irritable, confused. That can impact on, you know, how you're feeling generally. You're feeling frustrated with your diabetes. You're feeling frustrated with how you're managing your diabetes because you managed your diabetes exactly the same way yesterday as you're doing it today, and today you're having a major problem with it, whereas you didn't yesterday. So all of those things can impact on, how you're feeling about it. And then, of course, there's the social consequences as well. So, put those two things together with having a hypo in front of other people, with work colleagues or out in public, people that you perhaps don't know particularly well, or, you don't necessarily feel that comfortable around. That can be very embarrassing for people, very awkward. You feel like you've got to explain yourself. You may experience some stigma around that, around what other people's perceptions of you might be, because you're displaying these symptoms or you're behaving in certain ways that people aren't used to seeing from you. So there can be a lot of impact on, your daily life, your daily work, your daily interactions with people. And of course, then when you bring that closer to home in terms of your relationships with family members and friends, of course, those people care about you, but there's also the impact that, having hypoglycemia and all that that entails can have on that relationship with those people in your life, because they're frustrated by it as well, or they're frustrated by how you might or might not be dealing with it, and you're frustrated by their reactions to it. So it can cause a lot of interpersonal conflict as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a comment from somebody. Liz says that hypos knock her for a 6. I become that tired and just don't want to do anything after treating one. Please do contribute your comments or ask questions. We've got Jane here. Really, you should take advantage of that and ask her lots of questions. These sessions are always so much better when they are interactive, but thank you for that comment. But I think let's pick up a little bit on that issue around relationships and perceptions of other people. I remember hearing people saying to me when I was like, oh, what did you do to cause that? And when I started thinking about that, it became such a difficult thing for me to answer, because most of the time, actually, I did nothing. But there is almost like this underlying idea then that I made this happen, that I caused this to happen, and that it was purposeful. And really, it never, ever was. It's just part of diabetes. That can become a real issue for people, can't it? How do people respond when they're feeling that, I guess it's judgment a little bit, but how do they respond when they feel that judgment?
Yeah, well, how does anyone feel when they're being, judged or accused of something that they may or may not have done? People often get on the defensive, or they, get, kind of aggressive about that. It just causes a conflict between the two people, because there's a lack of understanding and perhaps a lack of empathy about the situation. But you're absolutely right, Renza, that it's not easy to prevent hypos at all. And I think that's kind of the first thing that we need everyone to appreciate, is that it's just not necessarily an easy thing. It sounds like it's just a matter of a brief balancing act of, well, make sure that you've taken the right amount of insulin for the right amount of food or the right amount of physical activity. But we know that there's so many other things that can go into causing a hypo, your stress levels, the humidity that day, hormones, all of these things play a part underneath the surface that you may not even be aware of. Or certainly even if you are aware of them, you don't necessarily know how much they're impacting on you or exactly what you can do to counter that. So there's a lot of issues there that, like I say, are under the surface. And then, of course, there's, actually detecting a hypo, actually knowing you're having one. So that's, involving constant vigilance, not an easy thing to be doing. It's okay to say, well, check your glucose levels 5 or 6 times a day. But for people who are particularly prone to hypoglycemia, or at certain points are just, having a bad time of it and having more frequently than that, then you're probably looking at checking an awful lot more than 5 or 6 times a day. And that's really impacting on someone's life and their ability to get on with everything else in their lives. So it's just not that easy to do.
Yeah.
And of course, once you've detected that you're having a hypo, or that, glucose levels are sort of starting to trend down, then you've got to be thinking about what to do about it and when to do something about it, and have you got everything with you that you might need to be able to do something about it. So there's a lot of decision making, problem solving, judgments to be made about how and when to do something about this. So it's really just not as straightforward as saying, well, why didn't you prevent that? Why didn't you stop it happening?
Yeah, I've now got an answer when somebody says, what did you do to cause that? And I say, I have diabetes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I have diabetes, that'd be why. Yeah.
Well, it is exactly that, isn't it? The hazard of having diabetes, because you haven't got the, the natural mechanisms in place that the rest of us has got to prevent the glucose levels going low. So you have to manage that manually, and yeah, that's
tough. It's a tough gig. We have a comment, and this is, I guess, where this just picks up some, a real life experience, I guess, Jane, of what you just said. Donna says, I had a hypo at our footy club meeting. I grabbed a Coke, then had a sandwich. The fellow committee member, who is a paramedic, told me that diabetics shouldn't drink Coke.
Yes. That is so, well, I've heard that kind of comment a lot of times before. And it's that classic thing of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Because people, out there, even those who have some medical training, have their own idea about what it is to live with diabetes, and they just don't know what the reality of that is.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that paramedic wanted a gig that night and was hoping if she hadn't drunk the Coke that they needed their assistance. And then a comment from Ross who says, I have at least 2 hypos a week. He has a very busy and demanding job. And that's part of it, isn't it? I mean, hypos often happen, so hypos happen, when we are doing jobs that are very demanding of us. And that could be just demanding in the sense of that we're sitting at a computer and typing away and we lose track of time and we've missed a snack or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how we explain that, but that's just
what can happen when you're sitting on the sofa watching a film or TV, because you're attending to what's in front of you, and you're in the zone, you're enjoying that, and so you're just not paying attention to what's going on with the glucose levels, because unless you do have a continuous glucose meter, or unless you stop what you're doing to check your glucose levels with a finger prick, then you're not going to know necessarily.
Exactly. We have a question. Can hypos cause memory loss?
Yes, they can. I think that the evidence now suggests that it's not a major concern in the longer term. So people shouldn't be, overly concerned about the long-term cognitive impacts. But what we do know about memory, and particularly for nocturnal hypoglycemia when people are asleep, is that basically we lay down memories while we're asleep.
Yep.
So if you're having hypoglycemia while you're asleep, then you're not able to lay down those memories from the day before. Yeah. And so that is that pattern, or that natural pattern that's going of things that are going on in your brain while you're asleep is interrupted and not able to happen, and that can cause some issues with memory and into the longer term, but for most people it's not a major problem.
Now, Jane, you and I are both involved in a project that's being, it's a European project called Hypo Resolve. And I'm on the patient advisory committee, and you're co-leading one of the work packages, and it's specifically the work package that is around the psychological impacts of hypoglycemia. One of the reasons that I was so interested and keen to be a part of this project was because of your work package. I was so excited that talking about hypoglycemia, but not just looking at this is a massive project. There are lots of different aspects to it. So all of the things that I sort of assumed would be research, such as hypoglycemia in mice, and also, recategorization of the terminology that we use, and lots of sharing of data of people living with hypos and everything, but specifically looking at the psychological impacts of hypos. That's what you're doing. But can I ask, why hasn't this been something that has been part of research projects routinely until recently? Why have we just focused on that clinical side of things? And I should just probably say this is for all of diabetes. It's not just hypoglycemia, but how is that needle shifting? It's because of people like you, obviously, but how is that needle shifting, and why is it important that it does?
Yeah. I mean, we haven't got all day to talk about this, and that I could. We've just seen on Twitter this week massive underfunding of NHMRC projects. Yeah. It's a big issue in Australia at the moment, but it's a big issue worldwide with the lack of funding for medical type research. If you then add into that equation, the psychological impact of medical issues, then they get even less attention. So this has been this is a perennial issue, a big problem over a long period of time. And there have been numerous studies over the years. We shouldn't discount that there's a lot of research going on into the psychological aspects of hypoglycemia. but not always in the major trials that are going on. So often they're looking at how to prevent hypoglycemia, or they're looking at the impact of hypoglycemia on medical issues such as cardiac function and other issues. But actually, I would say over time, hypoglycemia has probably been one of the least researched aspects of diabetes, which is quite remarkable when you consider how frequent it is and how much of an issue it is for people in their daily lives. And I think that really goes back to people's concerns about preventing the longer term complications. So I think for a long time, hypoglycemia has been considered to be, in terms of its severity, something that affects very few people. And in terms of what we would call self-treated hypoglycemia, or what some people would call mild hypoglycemia, that's kind of been considered to be just a bit of an inconvenience that people can live with on a daily basis. So the major research hasn't really looked into that type of hypoglycemia in sort of mainstream medical research, if you like. I think that's kind of the main reason for that.
Yeah.
But I think over the last few years, it's been highlighted that we really haven't shifted the needle enough in terms of how to prevent any kind of hypoglycemia, or indeed on really understanding its impact. So, we'll be celebrating 100 years of the discovery of insulin next year, but people are still having hypos as a result of taking that insulin. So, of course, it's wonderful that we've got that as a medical treatment, but we do need to understand more about this side effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Jane, how can technology help people with hypos? So you mentioned earlier that people need to check their glucose levels, and continuous glucose monitoring might make that easy, because it's just a matter of looking at the app on your phone, or whatever it might be, however you're reading that data. Can technology help people?
Yes, absolutely. Technology can help. If we think about the two main types of technology, we've got insulin pumps for delivering insulin, and we've got glucose meters. So let's think about the insulin delivery side of things, first of all. So if you're injecting insulin, say 3 or 4 times a day, then you're going to be injecting a decent amount of insulin at those particular points. And so that means you've got a big amount of insulin going in at one time, and that of course is going to put you at higher risk of having a hypo if you haven't got everything else in balance. So these larger doses of insulin are definitely part of the issue. So for those people who are able to use an insulin pump, that often reduces their risk of hypoglycemia quite a lot, because it's a smaller infusion, being literally drip fed over many hours of the day, rather than these discrete large injections. So that's kind of one area. When we go to the other side about monitoring glucose levels, of course, if you think about just using a finger prick 4 or 5 times a day, then all you're getting is very small windows into what's going on. And if you think about that as like dots on a graph, all you can see is these dots, and you don't really know where the line is in between. So you don't know whether these two dots get joined by a straight line, or whether something happens in between or goes up and down. You just don't know any of that without that continuous glucose monitoring. So if people do have access to a continuous glucose monitor, or to Flash Libre monitoring, which is a slightly different type of continuous glucose monitoring, but still providing a lot more insight than you get with finger prick monitoring, then again, both of those things can be very beneficial to people, because they can really see what's going on with the trends of their glucose levels. So that's where the benefits are, of course. But for those people who don't have access to those technologies, I don't think we should be overly concerned about that. Yes, there's lots of good reasons why you would want to get access, and we should always be doing more to campaign for that, to make sure that more people have it. But we've now got studies that demonstrate that you can achieve exactly the same results in terms of preventing hypoglycemia, reducing its impact, reducing the fear of hypoglycemia, with the finger pricks and the insulin injections, just as well as the continuous glucose monitoring and the insulin pumps. And yes, it takes a bit more work. I wouldn't dismiss or deny that. But in terms of the overall outcome of, can you prevent hypoglycemia, can you reduce its impact, yes, absolutely, you can do that without technology.
Yeah. And I know that although the technology can be brilliant, and, you know, full declaration here, I use a continuous glucose monitor that I fund because I'm not eligible for the CGM initiative. But it's not a cure-all. And I think that that's probably important to acknowledge as well. People can still have hypos, can't they, even if they're using a continuous glucose monitor?
Oh, absolutely. For all the reasons that I said before, because you can't necessarily get everything in balance. So just because you can see what's happening doesn't necessarily mean that you can prevent it all the time. There's lots of other things going on. Also, some hypos come on faster than others. So even if you can see the downward trend happening, it might start, you know, it might be happening faster than you imagined it would be happening, and so on. But it also depends on people stopping, taking time to do something about it. And not everyone can do that in every situation either. So I think, you know, we should always remember that it's not just about knowing that it's happening, it's about being able to do something about it too.
Yeah, definitely. I want to talk a little bit about fear of hypoglycemia. So let's talk about that next. But just a reminder to people to please do send us any questions that you might have, because we would love to be able to answer them, or any comments of your experiences of living with hypos. But let's talk a bit, Jane, now about fear of hypos. This can be really quite debilitating for people, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about fear of hypoglycemia, I think it's important to consider that kind of spectrum of, you know, fear. So that can go from, you know, mild concern on one end to extreme fear on the other end. And as we've said, you know, hypoglycemia can be very debilitating, and it can have all sorts of consequences that can make people very fearful of it. But let's just kind of talk about the other end of the spectrum for a moment, because, you know, fear isn't always a bad thing. Or let's just say mild fear. Concern isn't always a bad thing. I think it's important that we have, you know, a certain appreciation that a level of concern is actually a healthy thing. It's rational, it's adaptive, it keeps a person attentive to the fact that there is risk and there is some danger, and it keeps a person responsive to that. When we think about people who have no fear of their hypoglycemia, those are the people that we often see having the most problems with hypoglycemia, because actually they're not able to do those things that would prevent them from having that hypo. So fear can be a very helpful thing in small doses, if you like, you know, as a concern. But fear is, you know, a problem in itself. So, you know, fear can lead to acceptance of hyperglycemia. So those higher blood glucose levels, if someone is very fearful of having a low blood glucose level, then they'll run their blood sugar levels higher. And, you know, in the short term, to be able to drive a car for 15 minutes, you know, that's not a major problem to do that. You know, at a certain point of the day, most days, that might not be a major problem, but to be continually running your blood glucose levels that much higher in order to avoid hypoglycemia, or to avoid, you know, your own perception of whether or not you're at risk of hypoglycemia, that can be a problem. And fear of hypoglycemia can lead people to omit their insulin. It can lead them to avoid physical activity. So some people just, you know, wouldn't want to do any kind of physical activity because that's what they link, they associate that with bringing on a hypo. So that obviously we know that physical activity is really important for our health overall. So that's an issue too. So there's all sorts of reasons why people can be fearful of hypoglycemia and why that's a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we do have a question. I'd like to know the side effects of hypos. So this might pick up a little bit on some of the memory loss stuff, Jane, but let's see. My son can't tell me when he's having one, and if an hour goes by with no scan of his sensor, and then I realise he's low. He's sometimes been low for an hour, and I'm worried what this is doing to his brain. So sometimes we know, I mean, I know that I can wake up in the morning and I can check my CGM, and I will have been low for a couple of hours, and I sleep through the alarms, and my husband sleeps through the alarms, probably because I've been wearing one of these for so long. We've become a little bit used to them. We don't always wake up to those, to the alarms. Is it something to be really worried about? I mean, obviously all hypoglycemia, we should be thinking about what we can do to reduce it. But what would you say to Nicole, who's feeling a bit of concern here about her son?
Yeah, first of all, I'd say that I'm not an expert in child diabetes.
Yeah.
So I really don't want to comment specifically on children with hypoglycemia, because it hasn't really been my area of research, and I don't know all of the studies that are on there, and there are quite a lot of differences between children and adults having hypoglycemia. I think it's not a major concern to, realise that you may have been low for a little while and then you deal with it, because obviously you're conscious and you're able to deal with it. So that's, all of those signs are there that actually that's not been a major problem for you as an adult. But I think really we don't actually have the real data on this. Okay. And the reason I say that is because we don't have that many studies of where we've had continuous glucose monitoring in the background, looking at what's going on when people don't realise they're hypo. So, people's awareness of hypo depends on either them being alert to their symptoms and that they know that when they start to have certain symptoms that probably means they're having a hypo, or it means awareness of hypo is reliant on them doing a finger prick or checking their CGM and knowing that they're having hypo. But it may well be that people are having some lower glucose levels for quite a lot of the day and just not necessarily aware of that. And I really don't think that we know enough about what that looks like in terms of longer term consequences just yet. But our colleagues in the Hypo Results study are doing that kind of work. So we're just embarking now on a study called Hypometrics, in which we're inviting people this is in Europe, to wear CGM over several weeks, where we'll be able to monitor everything that's going on with their hypoglycemia during that time. And we're also asking them lots of questions every single day of that study. And we're really grateful to anyone who wanted to take part in that study, because it's really going to be quite intensive. But the whole idea of that study is that we really don't know exactly we don't really even know how to define hypoglycemia in terms of what amount of hypoglycemia for how long, how low is of clinical consequence. And if we don't know what's of clinical consequences, we certainly don't know what's of psychological consequence for people. So that's a study that is ongoing. It's literally just started in the last few weeks, and that will be ongoing over the next year.
Yeah, I'm so excited about the hypometric study, and a bit annoyed that I can't participate, because I just would love to actually take part in it. But I know, I've had a look at those questions. It is going to really collect a lot of information that hopefully will really shed some light on these things. I love the idea of collecting information about how people feel. If they didn't, and did they feel different when they had a hypo overnight or not, and they didn't realise? And I just think that this is actually going to provide us with lots of information. So if there are people from Europe who are watching, please do search for hypometrics and participate if you can, because I think we need lots of people with diabetes to participate in that. Yeah. But Jane, I just want to touch about fear of hypos just a little bit more. What can people do if this is a real concern? Who do they talk to? What sort of things should they be asking their healthcare professionals? What should they be thinking for themselves? Because it's a perfectly understandable and normal thing to be afraid of hypos, especially if you've had some really scary experiences. So what could people be doing about that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of ways to be thinking about fear of hypos. So first of all, it's about knowing whether you're just fearful or whether your risk matches your fear. Right. So some people are very fearful, but actually they're quite at low risk, and they haven't had a severe hypo for a long time, and they don't have recurrent hypos very much, but they are still fearful. Now, they can be fearful because they had one severe hypo 5 years ago, but it was such a horrible episode for them that they never want to experience that again. Yes. Some people are fearful because they, have them quite regularly, and, it's very disruptive and again, very unpleasant experience. And they're fearful because they have them quite a lot and they're unpredictable and so on. So there's lots of reasons why people might be fearful, but that may or may not be linked to their risk. So the first thing to do, I think, is to have a conversation with your health professional about your experiences of hypoglycemia. and talk with them openly about how, how often you have hypoglycemia, how it affects you, how you feel about that, if it is impacting on how you see your diabetes and how you live your life. Some people, there's different ways in which people cope with fear of hypoglycemia as well. Some people cope with it in a very practical way. I had a hypo, what caused it, what can I do to prevent another one? They take action about it, and they're really proactive and very practical about it, and just see it as a kind of a matter-of-fact thing about having diabetes, and they get on with life. Other people are fearful of hypoglycemia and think, well, I never want to have another one of those, so I'll run my blood sugars high, and they manage it in that way. Or they're constantly snacking to avoid hypoglycemia, or they start to reduce their insulin because of that. Now, all of those kinds of mechanisms are compromising their diabetes management potentially. And that's another reason to have a conversation with health professionals is, how can I do this in a way that doesn't mean that I'm constantly at risk of hypoglycemia, but also I don't want to be at risk of longer term complications either. And then the other way that people cope with their fear of hypoglycemia is to restrict their activities. So, they don't necessarily do physical activities, or they avoid being alone. They avoid social spaces where they, may feel embarrassed if they had a hypo. They limit spontaneous activities and so on. And all of that basically restricts their quality of life. And it may not have any bearing on their diabetes management, because they manage their diabetes very well in order to, maintain a lower risk of long-term complications, but it's really restricting how they live their life and how their family may live their life and so on. So that can be a big problem as well. So I think in terms of having that conversation with health professionals, it's about being honest and open with each other about how hypos are affecting you, how it's affecting your diabetes and your quality of life. And then looking at that relationship between how fearful you are about hypos and what your risk of hypos is. And then once you've done that, your health professional is going to be able to, find some ways and identify some ways in which to help you with that, or indeed you have that conversation together and identify those ways of doing it. And there's basically two key ways of tackling it. One is about ensuring that the person with diabetes really has, enough knowledge and skills about managing their diabetes that they can minimize those risks, to the extent to which they can be minimized, of course, given everything else we've said today. But there are people for whom, going on a structured education course like Daphne can be very helpful. They don't, they may have lived with diabetes for a long time, but there's still more things that you can learn about it, and more kind of honing of the skills that you can do. So there's often practical ways in which diabetes management courses and so on can be very helpful in reducing hypoglycemia, and we've got evidence of that. But the other way is, of course, dealing with the fear side of things. So if the risk is lower, and it's really sort of a fear and an anxiety thing, then probably having a psychologist or some other mental health professional to work with you on those emotional health issues is going to be important too.
Yeah. Last year when we ran the Lowdown for the first time, and I'm sure that we're going to see the same thing, when we were asking people how they would describe hypos, it was amazing how different it was for people. So some people said it's a little inconvenience that I just deal with and then I get on with life. And other people said that, it's irritating and frustrating, and it takes up a lot of my mind, like a lot of my brain space thinking about it and dealing and living with it, but also thinking about it. There is, as with everything to do with diabetes, there is no one right or wrong way to feel about hypoglycemia, is there?
Oh, absolutely not. We haven't really even talked that much about people's awareness of their hypo symptoms, which can really impact on how quickly a hypo can happen for someone. And how unpredictable that can feel, and how all of that plays into fear of hypos as well. So and an awareness and risk of severe hypos both of those things are influenced by how long you've been living with diabetes as well. So someone who's been living with it, for just a couple of years, it, can be having a very different experience to someone who's lived with it for 30 years. Similarly, someone who's lived with it for 30 years, may think, well, I've got this down pat. I really know what I'm doing with this. And I treat it, in a very practical way and feel fine about it. So it really does vary a lot, from person to person.
Yeah. Now we have about 10 minutes left. So if anybody has a question, now is your time to share that with us. Otherwise we will not get a chance to do it. But let's talk about awareness of hypo symptoms. So I know that, I'll just very briefly, my experience is I don't really have hypo symptoms now. So my phone can suddenly start screaming at me, telling me that I'm low, and where did that come from? And I could have been low for quite some time and haven't realized. How does that happen? Why does that happen? And I do understand, obviously, why that would lead to people, and I have some fear around hypoglycemia, but why does it happen that we suddenly or slowly don't feel our hypo symptoms anymore?
Yeah. In a very quick way of saying it, it's basically because the body just gets used to operating at a lower glucose level. And so those symptoms that you have when you first when your blood glucose level first starts to go low, they just erode because your body just gets used to that. So your body's just saying, oh, I'm used to this, so I don't need to have a symptom about it. But there's also other aspects of response that kick in much lower down. And again, those symptoms just start to kick in at a lower level. So again, it's about that adaptation. So the more and more hypos you're having, the more the body's saying, oh, I'm used to this is how I operate, so I don't need to make a big deal about it. And so the person, doesn't have a symptom until the glucose is very low, or maybe even not at all. Maybe they lose consciousness without having had symptoms at all. So it's really important that if you are losing awareness of your symptoms, and sometimes people talk about hypo unawareness. Now, I don't think that that's really a thing, because hypo awareness is on a continuum. So I think it's really important that if you've got kind of any loss of symptoms, whether that's the frequency with which you're having symptoms, maybe, some hypos you have symptoms for and sometimes you don't, or you're having a change in the type of symptoms that you have. And again, symptoms, vary from person to person and also from hypo to hypo. So that's really important. Any of those kind of changes that you're starting to notice, that you don't have symptoms that you used to have, or you have them at a lower level than you used to have them. All of those things, go and have a chat with your healthcare professional about it to make sure that they're aware that you're losing awareness of hypoglycemia symptoms, and that you can start putting some mechanisms in place to deal with that.
I think that's so important. And also to understand that hypos do change over time. The symptoms will change, how you respond to them will change, and obviously hypo to hypo things change as well, but it's not a static situation. We need to, one of the best things that I learned really was knowing that I had to rethink about what those hypo symptoms were and what they might be. And I remember suddenly I realized I was yawning a lot when I was hypo, and no one had ever told me that yawning could be something, and it certainly hadn't been something for me. So things do change. Now we have a comment that I'll just quickly answer. So Margie, I noticed in America now have hypo pens. She's speaking about the Gavoke hypo pen. These are not available in Australia. So the way that these work, so of course we have our little orange glucagon kits that we have in our fridge, if we have one. It's in our fridge, and there is an 8 or a 9-step process to mix it all up before it can be administered. These are stable glucagon, so it's effectively a bit like an EpiPen. It's all ready to go. And there's also a nasal insulin, also not available yet in Australia, but I think that's a bit of a watch this space, because these things will eventually come here, and that certainly is something to think about, because having those sorts of emergency kits is always something that is really important. And that's probably my reminder to say to people, if you've got a glucagon kit in your fridge, go and check if it is in date, because if you're anything like me, mine go out of date, and that is the point where I get my husband to practice on an orange, so that because seriously, I think I'm more scared of the thought of him having to give me a glucagon injection than I am at needing one sometimes. So get whoever in your house is going to need to give that to you to practice. Jane, we're just about ready to wrap up. What are some last tips and tricks and things for people to think about when it comes to hypoglycemia and how they're feeling about hypoglycemia?
Yeah, I did want to end on, I've said go and talk with your health professional about this. Yeah. I think this isn't a conversation that many health professionals are having with people with diabetes for all sorts of reasons. The hypoglycemia doesn't really even feature in clinical guidelines very heavily until very recent years. So I think this has been historically a topic that health professionals haven't necessarily felt that comfortable with for some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. But also I think it's partly because they haven't really had solutions to offer people either. So I think it is a challenge, even just to have that conversation in the first place. So that's something that I just wanted to mention right at the end. So, do think about if you need to have that conversation with a health professional, what it is that you want to talk with them about, and make sure that you're feeling confident to have that conversation, because they may not bring it up with you and you need to be prepared to bring it up with them. And I think sometimes it's a challenging conversation for people with diabetes to bring to their health professionals, because they somehow think that their health professionals think that they should know how to prevent severe hypoglycemia. So if they're having, if they're suddenly having severe hypos, and they've already had diabetes for many years, why are they having that? Why aren't they?
What did you do to make that happen? Yes.
Yeah, what did you do to make it happen? Why don't you know how to prevent that? Because you've got all this experience of living with diabetes. Why don't you know this stuff by now? So I think people with diabetes often feel reluctant to have those conversations because they feel that someone's going to blame them or judge them for that. So I think it's really important to be, aware that you may be feeling that way and try and overcome those feelings so that you can have that conversation and admit that you don't necessarily know, everything that there is to know about diabetes, and that's okay. And no health professional is really going to expect that of you. And I think it's kind of an unwritten thing in people's minds that they are expected to feel that way. Yeah. And sometimes people also fear the negative consequences that as soon as they mention hypoglycemia, maybe their driving license is going to be, that kind of thing. Yeah. So it is really important to, be able to have those conversations, honestly and openly, without fear of those kind of things happening. And any health professional will be much more concerned for your welfare, and yes, that they do have a concern about things like whether or not you're safe to be driving or operating machinery and so on. But what they're going to try and do is work with you on solutions that are going to help you to manage your diabetes better, so that you don't so that you're not at risk of those kind of things. So I think it's good to have those conversations with health professionals, and just remember that hypoglycemia is common, as your campaign is saying. This week, hypos happen. This is very common in diabetes. So there's nothing to be feeling ashamed about here. This is just something that we need to talk about more openly.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the really great things about this campaign. And we saw that last year. There were so many people sharing their stories and talking about hypos. And what we heard from other people with diabetes when they were reading these stories was, this is great because I now realize I'm not the only one. So when somebody's saying I am having hypos a couple of times a week, or however many times, or more than, what we're told we should be expecting, we don't feel that this is something that's so out of the ordinary that we should feel afraid to speak about it with our healthcare team and try to address it. So I think that's one of the really great things about the campaign. So I would encourage everybody to keep an eye on all of the Diabetes Australia socials about this, because there's lots of information about it. Emily will put the website details in the chat function so you can have a look, and you can, or in the comments, I should say, and you can actually go and have a look at the website. You can see people sharing their stories. I always talk about how serious hypos can be, but I also do talk about the embarrassing hypos, because I've had some absolute shockers, and because I have no filter and I'm an oversharer, I'm happy to share those. There are a few of those that I've written about on my blog, so if you want to feel better about your hypos, go and read about some of my embarrassing ones maybe. But there are lots of those stories online, so you can certainly look out for them. And also do remember that we do have a competition, so you can join in. You just need to share a video or a photo and give us a lowdown on your hypos. All of the information is available on the Diabetes Australia Facebook page. And if you participate, you will go into the draw to win a $250 Visa debit voucher. So please do participate. Jane, thank you so much for joining us today and for also being part of our Q&As this year. It's always an absolute delight to see you and to have a chat with you and to learn from you. So thank you very, very much.
Oh, you're